Welcome to another Sunbelt Spotlight. This month we're featuring Native Americans during Native American Heritage Month, and we've had several speakers talking about Native Americans. Today we have Michael Wilken-Robertson, and it's a pleasure to have him here today. I've known him literally for decades and have been watching him work on this project for many years, and am totally delighted that we have been able to publish his book, the Kumeyaay Ethnobotany, the Shared Heritage of the Californias. If you check on our website afterwards, because we're having this special talk, there is a special price on the book if you'd like to get a copy. Before we start the program, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Mike. Anthropologist Michael Wilken-Robertson's research and advocacy work with Native Baja Californians has explored traditional arts, ethnobotany, history, languages, and cultural landscapes of these indigenous peoples. He has developed a lifelong collaborative relationships with Native artists and traditional authorities to foster cultural revitalization and sustainable community development. His research is disseminated through publications, collaborative indigenous community projects, museum exhibits, ethnobotanical gardens, and the organization of binational activities that promote the unique anthropological heritage of Baja California. Mike currently works as an independent anthropological researcher and a consultant from his home in Baja California. If you look down, you'll see a chat box. If you have questions while Michael is doing his presentation, be sure to jot your questions in there. And when he is finished with the presentation, we will open it up, and Rebecca will be selecting some questions that Michael will be able to respond to. Again, thank you for joining us. And afterwards, I'll also tell you about the upcoming spotlights. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael Wilken-Robertson.
Okay, hello everybody. And thank you so much for being here today. I know we'd all love to be in person, but isn't it just amazing that I can be here in Baja California and you're wherever you are. And here we are in some way all together. So I am very thankful that we can have this meeting today. And I really appreciate your interest in this subject, which is something that I'm delighted to talk with you about. So I want to just start off saying that this work is dedicated to Baja California's Native peoples, past, present, and future, and to all who work for the preservation of Baja California's natural and cultural heritage. And it's an honor for me during Native American Heritage Month to get to speak. I'm not Native myself, but I've been very honored to have many long-term relationships for 40 years now with different members of the Native communities on both sides of the border. And that's just been a great honor for me. And I really appreciate those friendships. So I also just want to mention that after we were able to, after I was able to do my master's work at San Diego State University, and that was a several-year process, and actually 40 years of working with tribes and learning from them. And really, so much of this book is their knowledge, and I want to recognize that too, that really they're co-authors in so many ways of what you read in the book. So thankfully, when the time came to publish the manuscript and to make this beautiful book, with the help of photographer Deborah Small and other great photographers who shared their work, including some indigenous photographers. We also had the support of many of the tribes from San Diego County, as well as several foundations. And many of them mentioned that the importance of making sure that this knowledge is passed on. And that's actually exactly what many of the elders I worked with said to me too, that they they asked me to make sure that this knowledge would not get lost in this world where young people are often, moving into the cities and not really paying attention. This hopefully is a way that is something that can interest young people from the tribal communities into the future, as well as everyone who lives in this, in our region, and is interested in the long-term, going back thousands of years, importance of these resources for people who have lived here for so long. So this is a story that starts a long time ago, longer than our lifetimes, longer than 1,000 lifetimes. It's a story that goes back to the beginning of time when everything was covered by ocean. Two brother beings lived under the ocean, and after millions of years of thinking and thinking, they began to create the earth, the land, the people, the plants and the animals, the sky, the moon, and the sun. Early on, plants and animals were people too, but slowly they evolved into the way that we know them today. For thousands of years on the western edge of the continent, original peoples and their descendants spent their lives living along the coasts, moving in annual cycles through valleys and foothills to the mountains and down to the deserts in one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. In the course of a year, they could gather seaweed along the beach in the winter, greens in the springtime as they moved up through inland valleys and foothills, pine nuts in the mountains in summer, and acorns in the fall as they headed back down to the coast, along with countless other plants along the way. The accumulated knowledge and experience of hundreds of generations of Native Californians interacting with their plants and landscapes, refining and building on that body of knowledge, has sustained Native populations for thousands of years in ways that stand in stark contrast to what has happened to the land and the people in the last 2.5 centuries. In spite of these dramatic changes, today some of the ancient plant knowledge is carried on by the descendants of those who have lived here for so long. We would do well to listen for their wisdom. Ethnobotany is the study of the interactions between people and plants. The people I've had the great honor to work with and to know as friends are Kumeyaay, Paipai, and Coat people of Baja California. Kumeyaay territory reaches from the north around Escondido in the United States to Santo Tomas, Mexico in the south, from the Pacific Ocean to the Colorado Desert. This territory, the Kumeyaay Nation, was bisected by an international border starting in 1848. Before that time, during the Spanish and Mexican periods, the area south of the present-day border all the way down to the tip of the peninsula was called Baja or Antigua California, meaning lower or old California, and the area north of the border all the way up to Northern California was called Alta or Upper California. Together, they form a continuum known simply as the Californias. In the middle of this continuum, the region along the Pacific coast from Central California around Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo area, down into Northern Baja California, with a Mediterranean-type climate, forms part of the California Floristic Province, with many similarities in vegetation throughout the region. To the east, desert environments are found from north to south in the region, also with many similarities in vegetation. Thanks to these similarities, many of the plants found in Kumeyaay territory are also found in the territories of other native groups of Baja and Alta California. And in many cases, their uses have been similar. Kumeyaay territory is located right in the heart of this continuum, partly in Baja California and partly Alta California. Within Kumeyaay territory, There are many variations in the way people live and speak, including Ipai language in the north and Tipai language in the central and southern areas. But there are also many things about traditional culture and knowledge that are broadly shared throughout the Kumeyaay Nation, including ethnobotanical knowledge and practice. This common culture that transcends the international border forms what I'm calling a shared heritage of the Californias. Today, south of the border, many Kumeyaay live in remote ranches where native plants may still be abundant and continue to form an essential part of local economies. Many of the elders I've worked with over the years grew up speaking only their native language, walking barefoot, getting their water from a creek, and living in homes made from local plants. Some of their grandparents remembered stories of missionaries, soldiers, and marauding Colorado River Indian tribes. They've been extremely poor and faced countless hardships, but at the same time, their native culture and knowledge of the land often help them survive. Many of the plant specialists I've worked with never had a formal education, but their vast knowledge of plants and every part of the environment never ceases to amaze me. Although many have now passed on, fortunately, new generations of elders and recently more and more younger people have become interested in learning and transmitting plant knowledge. One of the great joys of my life has been the enduring friendships with many of the elders that I've had the opportunity to work with over the last 40 years. People like Teodora Cuero of La Huerta, who passed away in her mid-90s only a few years ago. Teodora was a dear friend, teacher, and kindred spirit whose joyful and dignified sense of being and profound affection for the land of her ancestors has been an inspiration for many. John Mesa, a traditional singer, and as he described himself, a binational Indian, spent many of his final years mentoring and passing on his knowledge of songs, plants, and other aspects of traditional culture to his students. Celia Silva of San Jose de la Zorra, whose wonderful sense of humor and vast knowledge of plants made visits with her an absolute delight. Fortunately, some elders like Teresa Castro continue to share their skills and wisdom in their own communities and at reservations, parks, universities, and other sites in the US and Mexico. A younger generation of up-and-coming elders also continues to keep ethnobotanical knowledge and practice alive through teaching and the ongoing use of native plants for foods, medicines, tools, construction materials, and ceremony. Many of this generation are also fluent speakers of their native languages and participate in teaching and research. Kumeyaay, Paipai, and Kuat languages spoken in this area are closely related to other native languages of Baja California and Arizona, belonging to a larger family of languages known as the Yuman languages. Once the dominant languages spoken in the region, these languages are now spoken fluently by only a small number of native speakers, many of them living in Baja California. The Yuman languages and their broad extension from the Pacific coast to the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River remind us of the thousands of years of history in this region. Relationships between these languages, such as Kumeyaay and Kukapa, and Paipai and the upland Pai languages, reflect ancient cultural connections. And I just want to talk a little bit more about this fascinating aspect of the languages of this land. These languages belong to what linguists consider a phylum or a much larger language family that we call Hokan, that tells us about very ancient relationships going back many, many thousands of years in North America. And in this case, Hokan languages that are distantly related, but that are believed to be related to all of these languages are found all the way from southern Oregon throughout Mexico and possibly into Central America. Now within the Yuman region, we can see what I've done for the book is to color code the Yuman languages that have an especially close relationship. So if you look, for example, at the green languages here, these are what linguists call the Delta California languages, because they go all the way from the delta of the Colorado River, where we see the Cocopah language, all the way over to the coast in Baja California and southern Alta California. And there's very strong relationships between those. Now, I've been mentioning the Coat language, which is a very small remaining language group that's found within the Pai Pai region. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But if we had that colored on this map, it would also be green because it seems to be closely related to Kumeyaay and Fokopah. So that's why I've included many Pai Pai speakers who are also Coat speakers in this study. I want to mention that Teresa Castro, one of the people that you've seen pictures of already, is a Coat speaker. She speaks Coat, Pai Pai, and Spanish, understands some Cocopah, and when I've taken her up to Arizona, she can understand quite a bit of some of the Arizona languages. And I remember many times when she said, well, I never even went to school. I don't really know anything, which is so sad that she doesn't appreciate her own profound knowledge. I don't know anybody else in her community that is as actively involved in, say, creating string out of agave fibers, making pottery, passing those traditions on. Fortunately, I shouldn't compare her to the others because there are other people in the community that are also doing important work. But clearly, if Teresa was a scientist, she'd have a PhD in the science that she has learned from her ancestors. During my field work, I had the opportunity to collaborate with many of these native speakers to document plants and their uses in both Kumeyaay language and in Spanish. In many cases, the names of plants are similar or the same throughout this region and can help us reconstruct ancient relationships between native groups. What we find is that the names of plants such as white sage here, which is shtai in many of the Kumeyaay languages, will vary a little bit from one community to the next. And north of the border, for example, in Ipai, it's going to be slightly different, which is something that we would expect. These are languages that have been here for thousands of years. People lived in their areas and they didn't have phones to just call down to the Tipai people in the southern region. So they were developing, their own languages were developing in their own special ways. And that's something that adds richness to these languages. In fact, over time, it would be likely, and many linguists believe, that Kumeyaay may be several languages, not just one language. But that's for the linguists to sort out, and native speakers, of course. The archaeological record of the region tells the story of how ancient peoples created stone tools like metates to process seeds like bitter acorns and cherry stones and transform them into nutritious foods. Some Kumeyaay continue to carry on these traditions today. Fragments of cordage, nets, and sandals found in archaeological sites have been dated at over 9,000 years old and are reminders of the ancient origins of traditions carried on today by a few native artisans like Teresa Castro, a Coat and Pai Pai speaker of Santa Catarina. Prehistoric basketry, occasionally found in archaeological sites, also reminds us that native peoples from throughout the Southern California and Baja California region have long been producing baskets made from local plant materials for processing and storage of plant foods. Split juncus coil basketry, strong, useful, and durable, is also part of the shared cultural heritage of the Californias. Today's basket makers create an astounding variety of beautifully crafted designs and shapes using the same basic techniques passed on from their grandmothers. And here we can see Aurelia Ojeda Diaz in San Jose de la Zorra with a gorgeous basket that she made, showing an eagle design with three main colors used today: the juncus natural sort of yellowish color, the reddish colored, reddish brown, which is we'll see in a couple of minutes, which comes from the roots, the bases of the leaves of the juncus, and the dyed black juncus. Isn't that a gorgeous basket? And two more just beautiful examples that we can see here. In Baja California, these baskets are made primarily in the Kumeyaay community of San Jose de la Zorra. This is Marisol Torres, also another resident of San Jose. And then there are a few more recent basket makers, but who are also doing fantastic work in San Antonio, Necua, another Kumeyaay community of Baja California. So these basket makers use two types of native juncus found in creeks and wetlands of the region. And I want to show you the examples of these two types of juncus, but let's notice here on this photograph of the way that a juncus basket is made. It's a split juncus coil basket. That means the juncus is harvested and then split. And one type of juncus is made into what the weavers call the tail or the foundation, the cola. And then the other type of juncus is used to make that one solitary strand that you see going off to the right. And that has to be wrapped around the foundation, a little hole poked and then pulled through. So it has to be very flexible and strong. So let's look at these types of juncus. So this is Juncus acutus. It's a kind of clumping type of a rush that grows in wetlands. If you've ever had an encounter with it, it's kind of sharp. It'll say, keep your distance from me. And that's the one used for the foundation. Now, the other type of juncus, also a rush, is called Juncus textilis, or textile juncus, weaving juncus. And this grows, as you can see, it's more of a spreading out type of a plant. It grows in rich, usually kind of moist, rich soils. Here it's growing in the shade of oak trees. And here we have the basket weaver Beatriz Carrillo, also from the Kumeyaay community of San Jose de la Zorra, although her grandfather, like many people, is from another community. He was from the Carrillo family of the Pai Pai community. He was a sheep herder who passed through this area back during the days when people were doing sheep herding, and he married into San Jose de la Zorra. Willow baskets made through an ingenious coil technique using branches and leaves of the native willow tree may be used to safely store the fall acorn harvest. Weavers create a strong wall that allows air in to help acorns stay dry while keeping bugs and other critters out. The development of pottery over the last 1,000 years also provided Native Californians with more options for processing and storing plant materials. The dried stalks of yucca, Mojave yucca, proved to be an ideal material for firing pottery. Cooking, toasting, soaking, storage, and other uses of pottery have allowed the Kumeyaay to use their plant resources more intensively and in an ever wider number of ways. The arrival of the Spanish in the region beginning in 1540 and starting permanent colonization in about 1769 drastically affected the Kumeyaay and their relationships with their environments. The introduction of foreign diseases, livestock ranching, and agriculture would forever change the Kumeyaay way of life and clearly had a devastating effect on Kumeyaay populations. No longer able to freely move throughout their traditional territories, many of them eventually took up a more sedentary way of life. The Kumeyaay found ways to transform their world while maintaining traditional knowledge that helped them survive. The shared heritage of plant knowledge has continued to provide food, medicine, tools, construction materials, and ceremonial items into the present. Today, their lands in Baja California have been reduced to a fraction of their original territories. They're located in 4 federally recognized communities. So we can see here the community toward the top of the map is Peña Blanca and Neji. Neji is found in 2 polygons, but Neji is one community that's not far from Tecate. It's in the municipality of Tecate. To the left of that and below is San Jose de la Zorra, where the basket makers live. Below that, San Antonio Necua, which is off to the side of the Guadalupe Valley. And then La Huerta, which is at the base of the Sierra Juarez, as we can see here. And then I'm also including here Santa Catarina, which is a Pai Pai community, but many of the Coat speakers live there. And there's a very ancient historical connection between the Kumeyaay and the people, the Coat and the Pai Pai speakers also of Santa Catarina, and even going further south into Kiliwa territory. And of course, with the Kukapa to the east in the Colorado River area. Now, this is an example of one of the villages. This is bustling downtown Santa Catarina, the Pai Pai community. This is also in the high desert at the base of the Sierra Juarez Mountains. This is, well, many of the people live in these communities, but often they still move out to remote settlements like this camp that the cowboys use when they're out herding cattle off in a more remote part of their community. And this I see as kind of an extension of the ancient way of life where people were very mobile and moving throughout their community, following different resources at different times of year. This is La Huerta community, as I mentioned earlier, at the base of the Sierra Juarez Mountains. The community is centered around a springs called Xta, and this springs was probably one stop on people's annual round from the coast around Santo Tomas up to the mountains. But as of once the missions were established and people were no longer able to move as freely as they had in the past, they often sought out places like this where there were permanent springs they could count on. And then from there, they still moved out and about into the areas where their ancestors had moved. I mentioned San Antonio Necua off to the side of the Guadalupe Valley. San Antonio Necua is found at the base of the Sierra de los Pinos, Pine Mountain, or Sierra Blanca, White Mountain, which is the largest mountain found kind of to the northeast of the Guadalupe Valley. And from the top of this mountain, you can pretty much see the whole region. And San Antonio Necua is one of the places where there are also basket weavers today, and a beautiful ecotourism project that the members of the tribe have created and that provides income for the tribe. This is part of Neji. This is the traditional creek called Ha'a, also meaning cottonwood. And we can see some cottonwoods here. It's another permanent springs, sort of remote creek found far enough away from where the Spanish settlements were that people could try to live peacefully out in these areas. But also from here, one of the great heroes of the Kumeyaay people in this area, Hatmil, a Mishquish clan member of the Kumeyaay people, was from this area, Ha'a, in the Neji community, and he led a major revolt against the Spanish, and was instrumental in working with bringing many tribes in the region together, also to protect his people. Going a little bit south and west, closer to the coast, this is the beautiful valley of San Jose. And San Jose de la Zorra is where many of the basket makers live today. You can see that in the bottom of the valley, there's a nice coast or oak woodland. And that's very common too. Almost, well, all the communities have their oak woodland somewhere within their community. And of course, this is important because oaks are such an important source of food, not by any means the only one, but one of many important foods that people have used for thousands of years. I want to mention that this photograph was taken by Angel Diaz, a young Kumeyaay man from this community. And when he posted this picture to Facebook, I said, Angel, what a beautiful photograph. Can I use that in my book? And he said, oh, I'd be glad to have it there. And I said, what in the world were you doing on top of that mountain? What led you to take that picture? And he said, oh, I ride my horse up there every morning because that's where I can get a signal and pick up my messages. So this is what we call collaborative ethnography. This is working together with tribes and it's a wonderful way to get more of their perspective. This is how he proudly sees his community. So the heart of this book is a listing of 47 plants and their uses. And this part of the book goes through each plant. It lists its scientific name, several variants of the Kumeyaay name, whichever variants I could find from Ipai and Tipai. And then the English and Spanish common names. I'd also like to mention that I had a lot of important help on this part from Diana Lindsay, who is in her own right quite an ethnobotanist and has published quite a bit on ethnobotany, is really an expert. And she also steered me towards some great resources from the San Diego Natural History Museum that helped me as an anthropologist try to get what at the time were the most up-to-date scientific names that we could. Of course, all of this is changing almost daily with the new science of genetics, changing everything we understand about plants. But I really appreciate that help from Diana. So with each one of these plants, we look at what the plant, we describe the plant physically, and then we also, I also try to go through any kind of harvesting techniques that the gatherers could tell me about, or anything that I could find through the literature from other California Native people. And from the wonderful book called Tending the Wild from Kat Anderson, I found that gatherers who like to gather the corms of the blue dix, which is what this plant is commonly called, Diclostoma, are very careful to just gather the largest bulbs, leave the smaller ones, which they call the babies. They detach those, leave them there, cover it back up with dirt. And when it rains again, there's a little funnel that takes the water down to where those babies are. And where you had one plant, next year you'll have a whole bunch of plants. So imagine that process times 1,000 people doing that, times thousands of years. This is one of the ways that Native people have shaped the environment where we live, that we often think is just a wild environment, but in many ways there's very much a strong footprint and handprint of Native people using these plant resources in many ways over the years. Another favorite plant for many Native people in this gorgeous photograph from Deborah Small is the what's called lizard's tail, or yerba mansa, yerba del manso. This is a plant that grows in wetlands, and the rhizomes of this plant are medicinal. The leaves, the flowers, they're all medicinal. It's a very strong kind of tonic and natural antiseptic. So, and this is also one that people can actually pick up and move around. And so some anthropologists believe that the natural extension of this has been extended by humans picking it up and moving it outside of the area where it might have naturally grown. It's many of these plants, like yerba mansa, grow very well in your gardens. And I highly encourage people to patronize their native plant nurseries in the area where they live, and rather than foraging from the wild. But unless you're a native person who really knows how to do that correctly, I'd strongly encourage people to try to grow many of these plants in their own yards and to not try to affect native populations. So, and besides everything else, it's very handy to have it right here in your yard, and they're beautiful plants. So this is thistle sage in Baja California. It's called chia. It's one of the types of chia. This is the chia that is more well-known and more commonly used in Baja California. It takes quite a bit of work to gather the little tiny chia seeds, but as we know, today it's considered a superfood, and Native people knew that long before it became, it got that designation, but people knew that they could gather this, and it's a very concentrated, nutritious kind of food that people could carry with them for long trips. Chia is also one of those plants that grows more prolifically after a fire. So I don't really have time to go into all the ways that native people were using fire management in their landscapes, but many of the people I talked to mentioned that they would especially look for chia after fires because it grows so prolifically. And chia can be lightly toasted and then made into a delicious drink. It's toasted, ground a little bit, and made into a beautiful drink. And here is Cecilia Adams from Nahi is showing us how she grinds on a grinding stone. Another wonderful plant for your gardens and a favorite plant among many Kumeyaay in Baja California for eating is bladderpod. I guess it's popular with ants also, as we can see here. Here, Yolanda Mesa and her sister Norma are gathering the buds of the bladderpod, and those buds then get cooked, and they have to throw the water off several times because it's very bitter, but eventually you get a delicious vegetable that tastes kind of like cooked cabbage, and you can make little tacos out of that. They're very filling. You eat a few of these and that keeps you going all day long. They're quite delicious. Another food that I really knew nothing about until people started telling me about how important it was for them is the holly leaf cherry. And not only can you eat the beautiful cherries, but you can, which you see here, which can be gathered, and there's a kind of a thin skin, but it's quite edible. And then you can also dry them and crack them open and get the kernel out from inside and process that. Now, there's a little disclaimer here. You have to really know what you're doing. And many of the native plant specialists told me people need to not just jump into this lightly. You need to really know what you're doing, because this is a plant, like many, that has substances that can be toxic or even deadly. This one has cyanide in it, and yet the cyanide is water soluble. So if you know how to process it by pouring lukewarm water through it several times, you can remove the cyanide and make a delicious atole, or kind of a mush that looks something like this. And I particularly like the holly leaf or islaya cherry pudding because it has sort of an almond flavor to it. Manzanita, which many of us know because they're such beautiful bushes. beautiful plants for landscapes. They can also be used to make a drink. They have to be soaked and softened up, and then the hard seeds removed, and then again ground and added to water, maybe with a little bit of honey, and you get a nice, it's called manzanita cider. Now, I just wanted to mention a few more plants. Many of us know the laurel sumac. This grows throughout Southern California, Northern Baja California. Laurel sumac is a plant that's considered a woman's medicine. It has a very strong effect on a woman's reproductive system. It causes uterine contractions. So again, it's not to be used lightly, but many of the women in Baja California mention this as something that could be used in childbirth if a woman was having problems with childbirth, to help induce labor, and or to help make sure that all of the placentas come down after childbirth. So again, it needs to be used very carefully and with somebody who knows what they're doing. But we can see that, as Doña Teodora used to say, she would point out to the hills and say, that's my pharmacy. Everything I need is out there. So this many thousands of years of people interacting with this environment, with these environments, has allowed them to get everything they need from those environments. On the desert side, we have the beautiful and majestic California fan palm. But did you know that these nice little seeds can also be used to make something like molasses? It's a wonderful kind of a drink that's nice and sweet and earthy flavored. This was important for people from the Cahuilla all the way down into wherever this grows, down into Baja California. The toyon, which also grows throughout our region, a wonderful plant also to grow in your gardens. Right this time of year, it's starting to get these beautiful berries, hence its name Christmas berry, along with toyon. And these berries can be eaten, but there's a special way that you have to do that. They're very astringent unless you know how to kind of heat them up and process them to take that astringency out. And like many plants, there are stories that go along with the plant itself that are important for people to know. For example, when you're gathering the toyon, you need to do it quietly. Children need to not be making a lot of noise or yelling. It needs to be done in sort of a quiet way. When I asked about that, it was explained to me that in part that's because you don't want to scare the bush itself. It might sort of retract something from the berries themselves. So we have so much to learn from people who know so much about these plants. Another plant that we often take for granted that grows throughout our region is California sagebrush. Not a true sage, it's an artemisia, but also a wonderful plant that's got natural antiseptic qualities. And in my book, there's a fascinating story told by Melindra. She's one of the basket weavers. I can't remember her name right now, but she talks about how she had a tick in her ear and how her mother made a beautiful, she made a drink or an extract out of this to get that tick out of her ear. It made the tick come charging out of her ear. Another plant that we see a lot is called mule fat. And that's the stalks of that are used to make the shafts for arrows. And Teodora used to tell me, you should make a tea out of this and put it on your head. It'll make your hair grow. Obviously, I didn't do it, so maybe I need to start doing that. And here we can see the shafts from the mule fat, nice and straight, long and straight. So just in finishing, I want to mention that as part of this project, I had the wonderful opportunity to work in a collaborative project with people from the Community Museum of Tecate, including members of the Tecate tribes, and Jim Hubble from Santa Isabel, many other volunteers to create this museum and Tecate, the Tecate Community Museum. And this first phase of it is all about Native people of the Tecate region. And then subsequently, there were two other phases of the museum that were created, the Ranch period and contemporary Tacati. So some of the proceeds from this book have gone to support the museum project. And also as part of this, there have been workshops carried out by members of the tribes with young people from the local tribal communities to teach some of this ethnobotanical knowledge and pass it on. And so I also wanted to mention that about 300 of the books in Spanish have been donated to members of the communities that participated in the project, as well as schools from all of the communities, cultural institutions, and museums, researchers on both sides of the border. And again, I want to thank Diana Lindsay for her help in working on the fundraising. She also took very seriously getting the funds to make sure that we could donate copies of the book to the Native members of the communities here in Baja California to make sure that it could be used by young people in those communities to ensure that many of these traditions are passed on. And finally, I want to mention that what I was able to cover is just one small part of the Native knowledge about plants. There's so much more to be done, and I really hope that younger people from the communities will also continue to be involved in carrying on this work, doing it in their own ways, and working with their relatives to document this and pass it on in whatever ways they want to do that to future generations. So thank you so much, and I'll be ready to take some questions. Let me.
Hi, thank you so much, Mike. That again, this was absolutely wonderful presentation, as all of your presentations have been. Once again, I want to remind everybody that the book is on sale for everybody watching this, and please take advantage of it. It's a wonderful book. It's available in English and Spanish. We're going to have some questions, but I have one quick question for Mike right now. Mike, how you were born here in the United States, but how did you get involved with the indigenous people in Baja California?
Well, I was very fortunate that I have both Mexican and U.S. citizenship, and my grandfather was born in a utopian colony in Topolobampo, Sinaloa, and eventually he moved here to Baja California. And because he missed many of his Mayo and Yaqui friends where he grew up, he got to know Pai Pai and Kumeyaay people here in Baja California. So from the time I was a kid, we had the great honor of getting to know members of those communities here in Baja California. And as an anthropology student, I was very fortunate to get to do field work in those, starting off in the Pai Pai community.
Absolutely wonderful. Rebecca, you have some questions that you can select and have Mike respond to?
Does the book talk about how to process the plants?
Yeah, the book goes into some deal with some deal of processing of, or some amount of the processing with certain plants like the acorns and the hollyleaf cherry. There's different levels of detail with different plants. So some people would like a lot more detail. And so if you're looking for that, then I would suggest there are resources online to try to find out more information. It's also ideal if you can get to know members of Native communities in your area. If they're willing to share that kind of information, then that's a great way to learn too. But do make sure that you really know what you're doing, because as I've mentioned, especially the medicinal plants aren't really to be played around with.
I might mention too that at the back of the book, Mike has a really great reference section. So there are many references to other books and sources. So that's another reason why you would want this book, is because it'll lead you to other resources. Rebecca, another question. We'll take a couple more and then we'll have to wrap it up. And I'll tell you a little bit more on other events that are coming up.
Were there any native plants that were regularly used then that are no longer or scarcely found today?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, that's a great question because there's been so much environmental change over the last couple of 100 years since Spanish colonization, and the introduction of cattle made a huge impact on the native habitats. The conversion of a lot of land to agriculture and later into urban areas. And so we know that, and even with climate change, we know that a lot of plants have been lost because of all those processes. So by kind of going through a lot of the historical documents that describe plants, describe landscapes, we can get a little better picture of how different they might have been, what kinds of plants were more prevalent, or plants that even disappeared. So for example, anthropologist Florence Shipek believed very strongly that there were native grasses that were completely destroyed by cattle, and that were an important source of food for native people that gathered these native grasses or the grass seeds. And so in the book, as Diana mentioned in the bibliography, there's references to those articles by Shipek. Jan Timbrook from Santa Barbara Natural History Museum has a wonderful article about vegetation burning among the Chumash, which you might not think you're going to find a lot of good information about this, but she talks about how the prohibitions against burning by the Spanish missionaries and Spanish functionaries, because they didn't understand what the Indians were doing when they were burning, those prohibitions actually affected the environment often in very negative ways, and kept some of the plants that were fire adapted from being able to grow back, or actually affected whole types of habitat. And so she feels that people's diet changed in many ways, and that by the time people like Harrington came along in the 20s and started documenting ethnobotanical foodways of native peoples, that they had already changed in a lot of ways. So often we focus a lot today on acorns as the staple food of native peoples of California, when actually there's quite a diversity of different types of plants that people have known in the past. Unfortunately, many of the elders that I worked with, and also many who worked with anthropologists in the 40s, 50s, still remembered many of those. And so those were written down. And when I asked people about those, even though they were no longer being used as often, they still had the memory of that. Or some people said, oh yeah, we still eat that once in a while. So a good example of that would be the agave that was eaten quite a bit in the past. And archaeologically, we can see that it was very important, but it's not prepared nearly as much today. It's very rare.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to remind folks that if you came in late, or if you know of people that would like to hear this, it has been recorded, and you'll be able to get a link to this talk on the Sunbelt Facebook page. And then also all of the other speakers that we have had for the Indian Heritage Month. We've had Geoglyphs of the Southwest Desert with Ann Morgan. Of course, we have the sneak peek to our new California Indian Basketry book, and Mike Connolly last week, who talked about Kumeyaay cosmology. So all of those links are there, and you can review those. And Mike Wilken's talk will be there in a couple of days. Just want to let you know that on December 2nd, we have a different kind of program. If you have small children, you might want to have them come aboard. It's at 11 a.m. and we're going to have a reading of Coyote Kloss. And it's a nice little Christmas story, and you'll learn a lot about actually the animals and a lot of their special characteristics and how they relate to this Christmas story. On December the 11th at 2 p.m., we're going to have another talk on our California native basketry. And this one will be on the baskets, the masterpiece weavers, the art and technology with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Alexander Schwed. So you're definitely going to want to turn in on that. They'll be talking about art technology and the religious metaphor behind the designs that are found in world-class baskets. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us for another Sunbelt Spotlight. And Mike, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. And check out and see what we have on our website and take advantage of the discount we have on this book. Thank you very much. And join us for another Spotlight on December 2nd. Bye.
Thank you.